Hidden behind a curtain of Spanish moss and rust-colored pines, deep in Vermilion Parish, Louisiana, lies the remnants of a religious boarding facility the state never fully admitted existed. Locals called it St. Helena's Home for Girls, but no official records confirm its founding, funding, or closure. Between 1962 and 1973, at least 119 girls were sent there. None were ever seen again. What remains is a sagging chapel, barred windows, a swamp full of buried secrets, and a trail of death certificates that list no cause. On paper, St. Helena's was a sanctuary. Brochures from the early 60s depicted serene portraits of girls in pressed uniforms reading scripture beneath oak trees. It advertised itself as a voluntary Christian refuge for troubled or unwanted girls, run by an unnamed monastic order affiliated with the Roman Catholic Church. It promised discipline, moral cleansing, and vocational education, often marketed toward impoverished Cajun and black families as a last resort for daughters deemed wayward. Despite multiple legislative inquiries and missing persons reports, the state archives contain no trace of the facility's licensing. The Diocese of Lafayette has denied all connections. The chapel still stands, but the silence that emanates from its empty nave is older than the stone it was built from. The institution's reputation. They called it the parish pearl. In the early days before the vanishings began, St. Helena's was spoken of in careful, almost reverent tones by the social workers and priests who recommended it. For desperate families, particularly in the rural outposts of southern Louisiana, where poverty eclipsed education, St. Helena's represented order. It promised structure in a place overrun with chaos. The marketing used to reach these families was subtle, personal, a church bulletin, a whispered suggestion from the parish priest. A folded letter pressed into a mother's hand after confession. Most of the girls came from Lafayette, Iberia, and Vermilion parishes, many from families with generational ties to Catholicism. Others were placed through less transparent means. Juvenile court clerks from Abbeville and New Iberia began referring repeat cases to St. Helena's in lieu of state-run juvenile detention. No paperwork documented the transfers. All agreements were verbal. In many cases, the family never saw their child again. St. Helena's presented itself as a religious novitiate. Nuns, dressed in cream-colored habits and navy trim, claimed to be part of an obscure Carmelite suborder, known only as the Daughters of Eternal Grace. They rarely traveled into town. Their leader, referred to only as Mother Eloise, never appeared in photographs and refused to speak with journalists. Still, the few public mentions of the facility between 1962 and 1969 painted it as an austere, if underfunded, operation. One article in the Abbeville Meridional, dated April 4, 1965, described a charitable Easter pageant held at the chapel where a dozen girls recited scripture in French and English. The photo accompanying the article showed smiling faces, but when examined closely today, the image raises questions. None of the girls are named. No teachers are pictured. The backdrop is faded pine, not chapel stone. Most unsettling, each girl's smile looks forcibly staged, identical in width and tension, as if rehearsed too many times. By 1966, local rumors were spreading. Farmers claimed they heard screams at night echoing from the pine corridor that bordered the chapel grounds. Hunters reported finding symbols carved into cypress bark, and once a bloodied uniform snagged in a barbed fence. Still, no investigations were initiated. A note buried in the 1967 minutes of the Vermilion Parish Police Jury mentioned abstaining from further inquiries into church-owned land due to jurisdictional overlap. No one clarified what jurisdiction was being overlapped. In truth, the line between church and state in 1960s Louisiana was not a line at all, but a blurred collaborative swamp. Several parish judges, school officials, and even a state senator had daughters reformed at St. Helena's. They vouched for the discipline, the faith, the silence. When parents inquired after missing letters or missed holidays, they were told their daughters had committed to novitiate silence or had transferred out for vocational training. If they pressed further, they were reminded that they had signed away guardianship. The only paper most families ever received after placement was a single typed form on brittle mimeograph paper. Acknowledgement of transfer to ecclesiastical custody. No logo. No return address. What made the situation even harder to challenge was that for every girl who vanished, there were 2 families who praised the place. That was the trap, the illusion of success. St. Helena's ensured that a small number of girls were returned, cleaned, polite, submissive, who then served as evidence that the program worked. In reality, they were the bait. In 1968, a woman named Claudine Bergeron of Crowley tried to bring her case to the state capitol. Her daughter Leah had been sent to St. Helena's at age 13 for truancy and minor theft. A year later, Claudine received a letter with no return address. It read only, "Leah has been called to higher service. Her soul is now clean. Pray for her continued peace." There was no signature, no further communication. When Claudine attempted to report her daughter missing, she was told that by signing the ecclesiastical transfer, she had surrendered all parental rights. She was escorted from the office. She began knocking on doors in Baton Rouge, calling anyone who would listen. She spoke to the press. A single piece aired on a late-night segment of a local station, KATC, under the title, "The Chapel No One Controls." Within a week, Claudine's apartment caught fire. The fire marshal ruled it electrical. Claudine survived with burns on over 30% of her body. She never spoke to media again. In early 1969, a state welfare clerk named Everett Dell stumbled across a discrepancy while updating files for inter-parish transfers. He was young, meticulous, and not yet jaded by bureaucracy. What caught his attention was the repetition of a particular notation. Final placement, ecclesiastical, no further contact. The entries had been filed under juvenile case numbers across 6 parishes. The girls were aged between 9 and 16. Each case had terminated abruptly, without discharge or follow-up. Everett found 17 such entries in one afternoon. When he raised the matter with his supervisor in Baton Rouge, he was told to avoid getting entangled in diocesan matters. That same week, his access to juvenile case archives was revoked. 2 weeks later, his position was eliminated in a departmental restructuring. Everett left the city and later published a quiet, ignored pamphlet titled The Disappearance Protocol: How the Church Disguises Custodial Erasure. Fewer than 200 copies were printed. Today it is nearly impossible to find. That same year, a girl named Nora Laverne briefly escaped the grounds. She was 13 and had been transferred from a Catholic orphanage in St. Martinville. A retired game warden named Wilford Pops Lejeune found her in the marshes south of Bayou Grand Chenier, naked except for an oversized linen underskirt, dehydrated and near catatonic. She had run barefoot for nearly 3 miles through sawgrass and oyster shell. Wilford wrapped her in a blanket and drove her to the sheriff's office in Kaplan. She didn't speak for hours. When she finally did, she told deputies about a room beneath the chapel, a tiled floor with drains, a woman called Sister Benedine who washed girls in salt water and locked them in blackness when they didn't pray right. She claimed that every Friday 2 girls were taken from the dormitory and not returned. Her voice cracked as she described the sound the iron door made when it shut behind them. The official report listed her statements as hallucinatory, likely the result of trauma. The following day, a nun and a priest arrived in an unmarked car. Nora was released into their custody. Wilford returned to the sheriff's office 2 days later to check on her status. He was told there was no record of her ever being processed. By summer of 1970, a quiet shift began to take hold in public perception. Parents started comparing notes. 2 sisters from Franklin, Louisiana, aged 11 and 15, disappeared after being placed at St. Helena's in May. Their grandmother, a laundress named Céline Boutin, called every number she had. She traveled to the chapel grounds and waited at the outer fence for nearly 7 hours. When a nun finally approached, Céline was told that the girls had departed for spiritual service abroad. The phrase became a refrain, repeated to other families whose daughters vanished from record. In August, a staffer at a diocesan auxiliary office leaked an internal roster to a local journalist. The document listed 72 names of girls labeled extirpated. Next to each name was a date and the word resolved. There were no addresses, no contacts. When the journalist attempted to publish a story, his editor pulled it minutes before press, citing an anonymous call from the Attorney General's office. A week later, the paper issued a bland editorial praising the community service of local faith institutions. By 1971, teachers at area public schools began to notice something. A pattern in the absences. Girls between ages 10 and 15 were being pulled mid-semester, always under the pretense of religious retreat or disciplinary relocation. They would not return. Teachers who asked questions were referred to diocesan offices. Those who pressed further found their contracts quietly unrenewed the following year. That same year, a young woman named Diane Rousseau turned up in a hospital in Lake Charles, admitted under an assumed name after a suicide attempt. She was 21 but listed her age as 17. The intake nurse noticed healed ligature scars on her ankles and wrists. Diane eventually revealed that she had lived at St. Helena's for 6 years, placed there at age 11. She spoke in bursts, eyes darting toward the corners of the room. Her testimony, taken by a psychiatric intern, detailed a ritualized structure of punishment disguised as prayer. Diane described long periods of isolation, weeks without verbal contact, and forced ingestion of lye-based cleaning fluid as penance for impure thoughts. She recounted being locked in the chapel's ossuary during thunderstorms and told to pray for dead girls' souls to escape from purgatory. When asked if she knew the fate of the other girls, she only replied, "We were not meant to leave. They only let me go because they thought I was already dead." She was discharged from the hospital 10 days later and vanished before any follow-up could be arranged. Her name was never recorded in state care records. Toward the end of 1972, strange occurrences began on the chapel property. A fire broke out in the administrative wing, but was quickly extinguished. The local fire department arrived to find the nuns already controlling the blaze with canvas buckets. The fire chief later remarked that the walls appeared to have been recently scrubbed down with a substance he believed to be kerosene. Then came the silent evacuations. Over the span of 3 months, the chapel's population decreased from an estimated 67 girls to fewer than 20. No public record exists of any mass transfer. No facility reported a corresponding intake. By February 1973, the chapel was abandoned. No formal closure was announced. The grounds were padlocked, the sign removed, the driveway overgrown with palmetto within weeks. Families who still sought answers found the contact numbers disconnected. When they visited the property, they were met with no trespassing signs and occasional patrols by men who did not identify themselves. The Diocese of Lafayette maintained that the chapel had been privately funded and operated independently by a foreign ecclesiastical order. No records were ever shared. No names were confirmed. Years later, aerial surveys conducted by land developers showed irregular indentations in the forest soil around the chapel. Some were 10 to 12 feet in length. Others appeared in twin rows, evenly spaced. When state archaeologists attempted to inspect the site under the pretense of environmental impact review, they were denied access by a private religious trust that claimed ownership of the land. The trust's name had never appeared in any previous documentation. Of the 119 girls known by name to have entered St. Helena's between 1962 and 1973, only 17 have ever been confirmed to have returned home, and even those cases are ambiguous. Most of those 17 refused to speak. One changed her name and moved out of state. Another was later institutionalized and never recovered. The remaining 102 have no discharge dates. No recorded deaths, no graves. The state had no shortage of people who knew or suspected that something was wrong. It was not the absence of warning signs that protected St. Helena's, but the dispersal of responsibility. Each clue, when viewed in isolation, was just subtle enough to be rationalized. A misplaced file, a contradictory address, a missing baptismal certificate. And always, hovering behind each inconsistency, the shield of religious autonomy. In 1964, a postmaster in Gueydan flagged a pattern of redirected envelopes. Letters addressed to girls at St. Helena's were being returned undelivered, but with no formal rejection stamp. Instead, someone had penciled vague phrases on the envelopes, "recipient moved" or "forwarding expired," in handwriting that never varied. Curious, he wrote a direct inquiry to the address listed on the envelopes. Weeks passed without reply. Then one morning, he arrived at work to find a typed note slid under the back door. It read, "Mail concerns have been resolved. No further correspondence necessary. No signature, no department, just the message." That same year, an emergency room nurse in Jennings treated a teenage girl brought in by a middle-aged couple who refused to provide identification. The girl had chemical burns on her hands and thighs. When asked what happened, she muttered only, "They said it would cleanse me." Before authorities could intervene, a man in clerical black arrived, produced a single sheet of paper, and removed the girl. The nurse never learned her name. In 1965, during a statewide audit of educational compliance, an inspector named Jerome Claiborne visited several parochial schools across the Acadiana region. When he attempted to access St. Helena's, he found the front gate padlocked. A white sign nailed to a cypress post read, "Spiritual exercises in progress, no entry." He left a note requesting a return visit. It was ignored. Jerome filed a report, noting non-compliance and recommending follow-up. Months later, during his re-evaluation tour, St. Helena's was no longer listed among his assignments. He called the Department of Education and was told that ecclesiastical institutions not registered with formal state curriculum were not under his purview. His initial report disappeared from the archive. He retired 3 years later and never spoke of the case again. What few realized at the time was how carefully the institution had constructed its perimeter of ambiguity. It was not registered as a school, nor as an orphanage, nor as a correctional facility. It used language that implied all three, yet evaded the legal framework of any. Voluntary novitiate, moral rehabilitation cloister, and religious service institute were terms that appeared on fundraising brochures, but none had legal definition. This deliberate ambiguity enabled the evasion of scrutiny. Civil authorities hesitated to intervene in religious matters. Clergy deferred to internal discipline. Families, often burdened by guilt or desperation, accepted silence as spiritual necessity. One of the more insidious warning signs came through the archdiocesan confessional circuit. In early 1966, a junior priest named Father Paul Marchand heard something troubling during a late-night confession in Lake Arthur. A man, voice trembling, admitted he had helped transport girls to the chapel and that he heard things through the vent after midnight. The priest asked if he had gone to the authorities. The man responded, "They told me I would lose my job, that I was imagining what I heard. But I remember the prayers turning into screams." Father Marchand raised the matter with his superior, who instructed him to disregard the confession as an unstable penitent seeking attention. When the priest insisted on pursuing it further, he was transferred within a month to a remote parish in northern Mississippi. He never again served in Louisiana. In 1967, an office administrator for the Department of Public Health noticed that death certificates from the region showed a peculiar anomaly. Girls between the ages of 10 and 16 were appearing on the state registry without corresponding medical records. No hospital, no physician, no autopsy. The cause of death in each case was left blank, and the place of death listed only the city, never a street address. The administrator flagged 5 such cases in a 2-week span, all originating from towns near the St. Helena corridor. She sent an internal memo asking whether the records had been misfiled or if an auxiliary medical facility had reported them incorrectly. The memo disappeared. 2 months later, she was reassigned to a clerical role with no access to death records. Perhaps the most disturbing ignored sign came from the grounds themselves. In late 1968, a surveyor working for the State Highway Department was mapping terrain east of Gueydan for a proposed expansion of Route 14. His logs included notes on a large unmarked stone structure with perimeter fencing and restricted access signage. He estimated the property at nearly 10 acres, far more than the chapel's publicized footprint. He also recorded the presence of what he described as deep rectangular impressions, possibly graves, but lacking any marker or identifier. His notes, filed under routine survey documentation, never reached the desk of any investigating agency. The Route 14 expansion project was later rerouted, bypassing the area entirely. In 1969, a part-time custodian for the chapel grounds named Louis Drago was dismissed after he spoke too candidly at a local bar. He told a patron he had seen rooms underground, not on any blueprint, with chains on the walls and metal doors that lock from the outside. He laughed when he said it, but his eyes were unfocused. The story spread fast, and by the end of the week he was gone. Some say he moved to Houston. Others claim he was seen wandering a cane field north of Abbeville, incoherent and muttering about the girls with shaved heads. No one ever confirmed his whereabouts. The nuns at St. Helena's maintained their silence through it all. Their public appearances dwindled until only one, Sister Marceline, was occasionally seen in the surrounding towns, purchasing bulk food and bleach from supply depots. She never spoke more than necessary and paid in cash. Witnesses remember her hands were always gloved, even in summer. The abuse did not require secret knowledge. It thrived through misdirection and deference. The church framed silence as obedience. The state disguised inaction as protocol. Every van that pulled through the rusted chapel gates did so without alarm, because each system believed it was someone else's responsibility to intervene. By the time 1970 arrived, the warning signs had grown into unmistakable patterns: missing reports, unreachable families, clerical redirection, and above all, the mounting number of girls who vanished from existence without triggering institutional response. Each one a warning unheard. In early 1970, a second-year nursing student named Madeline Curtis was assigned to assist in filing old hospital intake forms at St. Mary's Infirmary in Franklin. The record spanned back a decade. Among the routine injuries and deliveries, she noticed a cluster of admissions involving adolescent girls with extensive bruising, burns, or infections. Most had no listed guardian, only a clerical note. From chapel custody. The handwriting varied, but the phrasing remained consistent. She asked her supervising nurse if these girls had been part of a specific program. The nurse, visibly uneasy, told her to return to alphabetizing and not involve herself in archived suffering. Madeline did not forget. She kept a small notebook, copied names, dates, and conditions. She found 12 cases in total between 1963 and 1969. Each girl had been discharged after only a few days, with no follow-up visit scheduled. One of them, Marie Bro, had third-degree burns along her left arm and side, documented as self-inflicted during penitential rite. Another, Camille Durand, had required emergency stitching for what the form called interior tearing due to aggressive cleansing. Madeline showed her notes to a medical ethics professor at the University Hospital in New Orleans. He dismissed the implications, suggesting that spiritual retreat facilities often include ascetic practice unfamiliar to secular observers. When she insisted the injuries indicated abuse, he cautioned her against making unprovable accusations and warned that medical licenses had been revoked for less. She kept the notebook for 3 more years until the pages began to yellow and curl. When she later tried to retrieve some of the hospital intake forms for a graduate thesis, the archive room had been restructured. Entire file cabinets were gone. She was told that the hospital had reallocated its older documents to diocesan oversight for privacy reasons. Across the state, small observations were surfacing and vanishing like smoke. A registrar in Opelousas recalled processing school exit paperwork for a girl named Jacqueline Benoit in March of 1968. Jacqueline had been a quiet student, mostly average grades, no disciplinary problems. Then, without notice, her mother arrived and submitted withdrawal papers. The stated reason, religious retreat and moral correction. When the registrar looked confused, the mother avoided eye contact. Her hands trembled as she signed. 2 years later, Jacqueline's name appeared on a missing person flyer. The registrar recognized the photograph immediately, but when she called the number listed on the flyer, it rang through to a dead line. She brought the flyer to the school principal. He told her, "If it's a church matter, we leave it alone." Silence operated like a currency. It was exchanged, hoarded, and spent by those who feared losing their place within the institutional web. Teachers, clerks, nurses, secretaries, they all carried fragments. Some sensed the magnitude of what they were avoiding. Others dismissed it as peripheral tragedy, too vast to confront without consequence. A Catholic chaplain stationed at the Angola State Penitentiary remembered visiting St. Galenas once, under the invitation of a fellow clergyman. He had been asked to give a talk on spiritual endurance. When he arrived, he was led not to the main chapel, but to a low stone outbuilding behind the main dormitory. Inside, 12 girls sat in 2 rows, knees pressed together, hands on laps. Not one lifted her eyes. He noticed the smell first, a mixture of lime, bleach, and something sour beneath it. The nun who stood beside him gave no introduction. When he began to speak, the girls did not respond. Not a smile, not a nod. He paused and asked if anyone had questions. One girl, no older than 10, opened her mouth, but said nothing. Her lips moved, but no sound came out. The nun placed her hand on the girl's shoulder and shook her head once firmly. The chaplain left after 15 minutes. On the drive back to Angola, he told himself it was only unfamiliar ritual. That night he wrote a letter to his diocesan superior, describing the event and expressing concern. He never received a reply. By mid-1971, there was an increasing number of misplaced files across parishes. The Department of Children and Family Services began to note inconsistencies in guardian transfers and address records. One investigator, a woman named Lorna Meeks, reviewed a string of cases labeled ecclesiastical relocation. She requested supporting documents, but most had been signed with only a stamped seal, not an actual signature. When she pressed for clarification, she was summoned to a meeting with her supervisor and a diocesan liaison. The conversation was polite, but unmistakably coercive. They informed her that faith-based placements operated under special exemption statutes dating back to 1934. They showed her a single-page ordinance, vague and broadly interpreted, citing moral rehabilitation jurisdiction granted to recognized ecclesiastical entities. Lorna left the meeting with a reprimand in her personnel file and a quiet understanding. Her career depended on forgetting. The girls' names fell off rosters quietly. Birth certificates were unlinked from school records. Baptismal logs were amended in bulk, using rubber stamps and illegible script. Families who resisted were told their grief was interfering with faith. The phrase used most often was, "Her soul is at peace, she's gone to higher service." It meant nothing and everything. A retired embalmer in Kaplan, who had handled Catholic burials for decades, later admitted to preparing 2 adolescent bodies from the chapel grounds in 1967. He said they arrived at night, in unmarked caskets. Both girls bore ligature bruises. He was instructed not to embalm, only to clean and dress. The death certificates were already filled out. Acute pulmonary event for one, cardiac arrest under stress for the other. He signed "We're told." He never saw a parent. One girl, he said, had hair missing in patches. Her hands were raw. She wore a nightgown 2 sizes too large and had no underclothes. Her eyes were half open, mouth fixed in a strained grimace. He closed the lid himself. This convergence of red flags could not be called accidental. It was engineered. The abuse system at St. Helena's required more than concealment. It demanded complicity. Systems were instructed not to see or to reinterpret what they did see as permissible under the cloak of religious purpose. Every ignored report, every missing name was a stitch in the shroud that covered the institution's crimes. And still, no alarm rang loud enough. No single piece of evidence broke the illusion. Instead, the signs accumulated in quiet shadows. Each one pointed toward a vast machine fueled not by malice alone, but by the willingness of ordinary people to accept silence over confrontation. The chapel's collapse began, as most institutions do, not with confession or exposure, but with abandonment. In the spring of 1973, 2 brothers fishing along a cut of Bayou Cow Island noticed that the chapel property, once regularly patrolled, now sat still. No footsteps, no lanterns. The iron gate that had for years been locked from within hung ajar, its hinge rusted, its padlock gone. One of the brothers, Jules Landry, took a photograph from a distance. A grainy frame showing the chapel's stone front, one window missing, the wooden cross over the entry door rotted at the base. The photograph passed from hand to hand until it reached the desk of Eustace Rome, a part-time reporter for a Lafayette community paper. He recognized the building immediately, He had grown up hearing rumors about the place. Now, for the first time, no one was guarding it. On a humid Monday morning in June, Eustace drove alone down the overgrown access road that once connected the property to the main parish route. He parked when the path became impassable and continued on foot. The trees were heavier than he remembered. Kudzu wrapped itself around fence posts and the skeletal remains of what might have been a bell tower. The main building stood mostly intact. Its stones were blackened in some places, flaked with lichen in others. The wooden door gave with a push, its lower edge scraping against the damp floor inside. The scent was the first thing he registered, not rot, not mildew, but a sour, alkaline residue that clung to the nostrils and warned the body. Inside, the chapel was stripped of iconography. No crucifix, no pews, only an altar plain and unadorned, and behind it a narrow archway that led into darkness. Eustace followed the corridor to a staircase that descended into stone. The air turned cold. He used a cigarette lighter to guide himself. The basement, if it could be called that, was far larger than expected. The floor was concrete, sloped slightly to drains placed every few yards. Along the walls, metal hooks protruded, rusted and flecked with what appeared to be old cloth or hair. A small table rested in the center of the room. On it lay a book of psalms, its pages warped with moisture, its margins filled with notations in Latin and French. But it was the far wall that halted him. Carved into the stone were names, dozens of them, some etched carefully, others scratched with desperation. Most were first names only. Elise, Tanya, Mireille, Jo, Marie-Claire. Some appeared more than once, as if rewritten by shaking hands, trying not to forget themselves. Beneath several, dates were carved. Some included small crosses, others did not. Eustace took photographs. He retraced his steps, documenting the corridor, the stairwell, the altar. He returned to his car in silence, his clothes damp with sweat and stone dust. The next day, he printed 3 copies of the images. One he mailed to a contact at the University of Louisiana, who taught religious history. Another he brought to his editor. The third he kept in a locked drawer. The paper refused to publish. The editor, red-faced and jittering, said they could not corroborate any recent activity, and that the diocese had assured us the chapel was unoccupied and unendorsed. Eustace was told to drop the matter. 2 weeks later, he resigned. But the copy he sent to the university reached someone who did not ignore it. Dr. Celeste Dupré was a professor of religious anthropology and a specialist in unregistered Catholic sects. She had written a thesis on extrajudicial novitiates and understood the language of what she saw. The hooks, the salt corrosion, the psalm markings in code. She contacted Eustace through a university intermediary. They met quietly in a coffee shop off Jefferson Street. He gave her the coordinates. She brought gloves and a camera. Together they returned. This time, they entered not only the main building, but the rear structure, a squat, bunker-like annex with no windows. The door was half buried in loam. They pried it open with a crowbar and descended into blackness. What they found was not a living space, but a network of cells. Each roughly 6 feet by 4, each lined with concrete and equipped with a single drainage hole. Doors were thick wood with metal braces, no handles on the inside. Inside one cell they found a small wooden figure, perhaps a saint or angel, burned at the base, its face scratched out. In another, fragments of a girl's school pin, the kind given out by certain Catholic academies in the 1960s. The pin read faintly, "Service in silence." The inscription matched nothing known to the major orders. Celeste took notes obsessively, cross-referencing every architectural anomaly, every symbol. What struck her most was the absence of religious framing, no crosses on the walls, no devotional items, only discipline, only containment. They photographed what they could and left, sealing the door behind them. Celeste wrote a formal request to the Diocese of Lafayette, asking for comment on the Daughters of Eternal Grace and the use of chapel property in Vermilion Parish between 1960 and 1973. She received a reply, a single sentence printed on embossed letterhead. The diocese has no record of any institution by that name or activity on said property. Frustrated, Celeste reached out to a former priest she had interviewed years before, a man named Gerard Lemoyne, who had once served as a liaison for monastic oversight. He lived alone in Morgan City, long retired, known for his failing memory and fondness for gin. When she asked about St. Helena's, he turned pale. He asked if she had entered the lower level. She nodded. He reached for a manila envelope, yellowed and folded at the edges. Inside were 3 Polaroids. One showed a girl no more than 12, seated at a desk with her hands folded. Her face was bruised. Another showed a corridor of cells. The third showed an altar draped in white, but the cloth was soaked through with something darker beneath. On the back of the third, in faded ink, someone had written, "They said it was prayer." Gerard would only say that the order had no Rome papers, meaning it was never officially sanctioned. He called it a ghost order, founded by someone with local authority, allowed to operate by the grace of neglect. He warned Celeste to stop asking, said it wasn't just the church that wanted it forgotten. A week later, Celeste's university mailbox was emptied. Her department email was deactivated. She was told her contract had not been renewed due to budget reallocation. No explanation beyond a letter from the dean's office citing institutional restructuring. She returned to the chapel once more, alone. This time, she brought plaster and chalk. She marked each cell. She recorded the dimensions. She counted 17 distinct confinement spaces. Not all were empty. In one, buried beneath decades of soil and debris, she found a small human femur. Too small to be adult, too slender for male. She did not report it. She understood the cycle by then. By late summer 1973, the chapel had become a silent ruin, but silence never stopped things from being seen. A local teenager named Antoine Gaspard broke into the property with a camera, not for justice, but thrill. His photographs were grainy, unevenly exposed, but one frame revealed something that had not been documented before. A crawl space beneath the stone flooring near the chapel's nave. The photograph, poorly lit, showed the lip of a hatch recessed into the floor, partially obscured by broken tile and debris. Antoine had not entered it. He left the image undeveloped for years. When it finally surfaced, passed through the hands of an archivist compiling old regional imagery, it caught the attention of one man who could not ignore it. His name was Mason Perot. In 1973, he was an investigator with the Louisiana Department of Public Safety. He had grown up hearing whispers about girls vanishing along parish borders. The photograph, dated and geotagged, gave him what no one else had: coordinates to begin digging. He arrived at the property in September, unannounced and alone. His plan was simple: photograph everything, catalogue, report. Let evidence, not rumor, guide the conclusion. But the moment he stepped inside, the gravity shifted. The hatch was real, hidden beneath shattered tile fitted flush to the stone. No hinges, only a narrow iron ring to pull it open. Mason pried it back and was hit with the sour scent of old lime and clay. A ladder descended into darkness. He dropped a flare. It landed on packed earth 10 feet down. He entered. The chamber was not large, just wide enough to walk without ducking. The walls were natural stone, rough and unworked, except in one place where they had been flattened. There, carved into the rock with careful, unshaking strokes, was a series of phrases. Not scripture, not Latin. Names. Again, names. This time, full names. Beneath each, a series of marks, possibly dates, possibly counts. At the far end, a crude altar made of bricks. It was blackened by heat. Bits of bone rested in its cracks, calcined, crushed. One corner of the chamber was filled with rusted buckets and long, decayed burlap sacks. Mason recognized the pattern. This was not ceremonial, it was mechanical, a space for disposal, controlled, repetitive. He surfaced, sweating and shaken. He documented everything: photographs, measurements, soil samples. He filed a preliminary report, submitted it to the Department of Public Safety with a request for forensic excavation. 3 weeks passed. Then he received a call instructing him to meet a departmental liaison in Baton Rouge. At the meeting, he was handed a typed memo. His report had been forwarded to the Office of Religious Affairs for internal review. No further state investigation would proceed without ecclesiastical consent. He resigned 2 days later. The story might have ended there, sealed once again beneath bureaucratic indifference. But not all records vanished. Mason had mailed duplicates to an old friend, a freelance journalist named Bernadette Walsh. She lived in Shreveport, and though her work had never received statewide attention, she understood the stakes. Bernadette spent the next 4 months interviewing families. She found 13 who were willing to speak, all of whom had daughters sent to St. Helena's between 1961 and 1971. Their stories varied in detail, but not in arc. Each family had received assurances. Each had been told their daughter was in a place of guidance. Each had received a letter or message of finality, a blessing, a farewell, a request for no further contact. One mother, Selina Robichaud, remembered the precise moment her daughter's voice disappeared. She had spoken with her once by telephone. Léonie had sounded tired, her speech rehearsed. "I'm well, maman," she had said. "I'm learning obedience. I'm praying every day." Then silence. The next letter arrived 6 weeks later, unsigned, stating that Léonie had moved forward into higher devotion. Selina still had the letter. The paper smelled faintly of ammonia. Bernadette compiled the stories into a manuscript. She called it The Hollow Chapel. When she approached 3 different publishers, each declined. One sent a private reply. "Too hot. No support from diocesan or civic officials. Legal risk too high." She paid out of pocket to print 200 copies. They circulated mostly by word of mouth, passed among church critics, archivists, and bereaved parents. She never profited. But within 2 years, the manuscript reached a journalist in New York, and from there a documentary producer in Atlanta. The result was a short investigative piece aired once, at 1:30 a.m., buried between programming on a regional PBS affiliate. The segment included blurry footage of the chapel ruins, overlaid with a voiceover quoting from Bernadette's manuscript. It ended with a simple question: where did the girls go? The diocese responded within days. A statement was issued declaring the program deeply irresponsible and an attack on the church's charitable legacy. A senior official appeared briefly on a morning radio show, stating that St. Helena's was a private, independent facility, unaffiliated with the formal diocese and unknown to most clergy. The segment was pulled from future broadcasts. But the image had already sunk in. A chapel with no parish, a school with no records, a silence that no one had authorized but everyone respected. By 1974, a small group of amateur researchers had begun collecting oral testimonies and archive fragments. They called themselves the Vermilion Truth Project. Operating with no budget and limited access, they traced procurement orders, studied land deeds, cross-referenced old phone directories, and missing persons logs. What they found was astonishing. The land on which St. Helena's sat had never been deeded to the church. It belonged to a private trust created in 1958 under the name Compagnie du Cœur Immobile. The registered office had been in New Orleans, tied to a shell company dissolved in 1974. The managing partner had no public record beyond the filing. The building permits for construction listed the property only as religious dwelling, approved by a junior clerk whose name later vanished from state employment rosters. They also found a list, buried inside an abandoned diocese office north of Erath in a waterlogged file cabinet, was a mimeographed roster titled Corrective Intake 1962-1969, 97 names. Each with an entry date, a designation code, and a final status column. Most read fulfilled. No one ever claimed authorship of the document. No one at the diocese acknowledged its creation. The researchers presented their findings to the Vermilion Parish Council in late 1974. They requested an inquiry, or at the very least a public hearing. They were granted 5 minutes. After presenting the names, the documents, the photographs of the stone cells, the council members thanked them for their passion and adjourned without vote. Nothing further was pursued, but the material could not be unseen. Copies of the intake list were mailed anonymously to libraries, universities, and newspapers. Some were lost. Others filed quietly under historical interest. One wound up in the hands of a junior librarian at Tulane, who, recognizing a cousin's name, began her own investigation. The ruins of the chapel still stood. The names on the stone wall still legible. No official ever returned to examine them. By the early 1980s, the site had returned to the earth. Kudzu strangled the outer wall. Trees pressed inward. The road disappeared under moss and runoff. Locals avoided the land not because of legend, but from a quieter instinct. What had once been buried there did not want to be remembered. The few who had tried to dig had either vanished into the folds of bureaucracy or found their reputations hollowed out by whispers of obsession. Still, every few years someone returned. A daughter, a journalist, a retired investigator with brittle folders in his trunk. They came not with tools, but with questions that still had no home. In 1982, a school counselor named Denise Holloway moved to Abbeville from Baton Rouge. She taught civics and family law. On her second week, a student named Audra Delhomme turned in an essay titled Where My Aunt Went. The writing was strange, clipped and clearly restrained. It described a place with only women and walls, a chapel with no God, and something called the Quiet Room. The essay did not name St. Helena's directly, but Denise recognized a pattern. She remembered the controversy. She remembered the chapel. She called Audra's mother for a routine consultation. During the conversation, the woman's tone shifted when asked about Audra's aunt. She was taken, the mother said flatly. My sister. They said she was incorrigible. She left at 14. They said she became a novitiate. That was 1969. We never heard from her again. Denise asked if a missing persons report had ever been filed. The woman laughed. And tell them what? That the church misplaced her. Denise began collecting testimonies. She didn't publish or present them. She just listened. By the end of her third year in Abbeville, she had 37 handwritten statements. She stored them in a safe at the back of her classroom closet. She retired in 1993 and passed the folder to a colleague who added 3 more accounts. In 2002, the folder was left behind in a file cabinet during a school renovation. The janitor who found it didn't throw it out. He took it home, read every page, and left it on the passenger seat of his cousin's car. That cousin worked in archives for the State University. It sat in a drawer for 7 years. In 2010, a graduate student named Lara Pellier stumbled across the folder while conducting unrelated research. She digitized the statements. She began cross-referencing. She found correlations in language. The stairs were wet. The salt burned. They made us write our names on the stone. She submitted a paper titled Ecclesiastical Custody and the Disappearance of Louisiana Girls, 1962-1973. It was rejected twice, both times with comments about unverifiable primary sources. She published it online anyway, on a forgotten academic blog. It received 43 views in its first year. One of those viewers was a woman named Claire Meyer, whose older sister Odette had disappeared in 1966. Claire had been 6 at the time. The family was told Odette had stolen from the convent and been sent away for moral refinement. They never saw her again. Claire had spent decades believing her sister had chosen to leave. She emailed Lara within hours. Together, they compiled a map. Using Lara's archival references and Claire's interviews, they marked every named intake, every date, every confirmed placement. They found 98 names, 11 more than the official estimates. Claire drove to every surviving family willing to talk. Some answered the door and listened. Some cried. Others closed the door without a word. In 2012, a journalist from Baton Rouge named Marcus Durette discovered their work. He contacted Lara, interviewed Claire, and requested to visit the site. They took him there in August. The grounds were barely navigable. The chapel wall had collapsed. Ferns filled the nave. The hatch to the crawl space remained intact, but the ladder had rotted through. Marcus documented the visit. He shot video, took soil samples, brought a geologist who confirmed disturbed ground beneath the stone chamber. His report was ready within 6 weeks. He submitted it to 3 major newspapers. All declined. One returned a legal warning suggesting that continuing to pursue a story about unverified allegations against defunct ecclesiastical bodies could result in litigation. Marcus published the story on a regional news blog under the title The Parish with No Graves. It was read by fewer than 1,000 people, but one of them was Monique Hébert, a retired nurse who had worked in private care homes during the 1970s. She contacted Marcus anonymously, providing details of a girl she had cared for briefly in 1974. The girl's name was Colette. She spoke little, flinched when touched, and had a scar across her scalp as if part of it had been burned or torn away. Monique recalled that Colette had trouble sleeping. She would murmur phrases in French-accented English. "Too cold, no water. Not my sins." She took my voice. When asked who she was, Colette would shut down. One day, without warning, Colette was removed from the facility. No transfer record, no family name. Monique never saw her again. The statement lent weight to Marcus's article. He followed up with another piece, this time naming the chapel directly. It was online for less than 48 hours before being taken down. The server hosting it received a cease and desist letter from a law firm in Atlanta, representing an unnamed religious trust. By this point, the story had grown teeth. It circulated on small forums in private groups, among activists and archivists. Files were duplicated, the intake list resurfaced, satellite images of the chapel grounds were passed around, annotated with speculation. Some attempted to tie it to broader church scandals. Others treated it as local folklore, but buried within the noise were facts, names, dates, soil samples, letters, photographs. The church remained silent. The state issued no comment. In 2015, a quiet hearing was held in Lafayette regarding property use for undeveloped ecclesiastical land. During the session, an amendment was proposed that would bar excavation or structural investigation on religious sites closed before 1980 without diocesan consent. It passed with unanimous approval. The chapel's coordinates were not mentioned, but the boundaries defined by the amendment aligned perfectly with its parcel. No one from the public spoke, and still the story remained. In 2018, the chapel site was sold in a closed land auction to a company registered under the name Lantern Grove Holdings. The purchase included 97 acres, listed as undeveloped spiritual property. The buyer's identity remained protected under a subsidiary trust, and all filings were handled through a Baton Rouge firm known for shielding religious entities. Within 6 months, crews arrived to clear vegetation. Locals reported earth-moving machinery, cement trucks, and unmarked white vans. No signage was posted. When one resident, a former surveyor named Thomas Lorette, attempted to photograph the site, he was approached by a man in a reflective vest who informed him the land was private and the work being done was in accordance with permitted spiritual restoration. By January 2019, a new structure had been erected on the foundation of the old chapel. Smaller, modern, without steeple or ornament. The design resembled a meditation retreat center, low-profile, windowless, with a gravel perimeter. Public records indicated the building was designated as a contemplative formation hub. No services were held, no congregation visited. The construction raised old questions again. Claire Meir and Lara Pellier returned to the site, but were blocked by a metal security gate with a surveillance camera mounted overhead. They filed a public records request regarding the property transfer. The response came 2 weeks later, citing religious exemption under Act 88C, a clause buried in the 2015 amendment. The trust behind Lantern Grove Holdings was shielded from disclosure. A small group of researchers began to meet in a back room of the public library in Erath. They printed every document, collected every first-hand account, and mapped the changes to the land in layered transparencies. They found that beneath the new construction sat the original basement, untouched, the crawl space, the ossuary cells, the hatch. None had been removed or filled. The new structure simply covered it all. One of them, an amateur geotechnical analyst named Vincent Roussel, submitted a request to inspect subsurface composition for academic purposes. It was denied. He managed, through a colleague at a nearby university, to obtain an aerial LIDAR scan. The data revealed voids beneath the structure, not geological, not water-formed, linear, rectangular, evenly spaced, 17 in total. Identical in shape and depth to the cells documented by Celeste Dupré in 1973. Vincent published the findings on a technical blog. The entry received no mainstream attention, But within days, a representative from Lantern Grove Holdings contacted the university. Vincent's affiliation was reviewed, and his departmental funding was pulled within a month. He left the project, but his data remained. In 2020, a quiet protest formed. 14 women stood at the perimeter fence, holding the names of missing girls on poster board. They did not shout. They did not chant. They remained for 6 hours, unmoving. Local news ran a 30-second segment that evening. No follow-up coverage was provided. That same year, a podcast produced a multi-episode investigation called The Chapel Wall. It included interviews with surviving family members, archival audio from Claire Meyer, and ambient field recordings taken at the edge of the property. One episode was devoted entirely to reading the names carved into the basement wall: Elise, Tanya, Mireille, Jo, Marie-Claire. Voices repeated them softly, each name given a few seconds of silence. It lasted over 30 minutes. The series reached tens of thousands. It sparked renewed calls for investigation. Petitions were circulated. Letters sent to the Department of Justice, the State Historical Office, the governor. Each received polite replies. Each affirmed the need for caution, for respect, for preservation of spiritual privacy. No investigation followed. In 2021, a researcher from outside Louisiana took interest. Her name was Anna Feld. She had documented historical abuses at closed boarding schools across the Midwest and was familiar with institutional methods of erasure. She arrived quietly, requesting no access, asking no permissions. She visited archives, met with Claire, and collected copies of every letter, map, and testimony available. She noted something few had before. The intake list found in the Erith office contained columns coded in a sequence that mirrored old ecclesiastical penitentiary classifications. One column, labeled Transgressia, contained single-letter entries, I, D, C, S. Anna cross-referenced these with known clerical shorthand from pre-Vatican II confessional manuals. They stood for impurity, disobedience, conduct, speech. These girls were not being rehabilitated. They were being classified by sin. Not by action, but by moral interpretation. A girl who questioned, a girl who refused, a girl who spoke too freely. Each was labeled. Then, fulfilled, Anna published her findings in an open-access journal. She titled the paper Sin as Custody, the Disciplinary Theology Behind St. Elena's. It was cited heavily in religious history circles. She was invited to speak at 2 conferences. At the second, held in Chicago, a man approached her afterward with a plastic envelope. Inside was a page torn from a nurse's ledger. It listed 3 names. 2 had red crosses next to them. The third, circled twice, read, Arlette N. last one, quiet, watched. Below it, 1 sentence. Mother said close the ground. Anna scanned the page. The ink was fragile, the paper foxed and brittle. She cross-referenced the names. All 3 matched girls from the intake list. Arlette N. had no final notation, no fulfilled. She brought the document to Claire, who held it without speaking. Then she reached into a file and retrieved a faded photograph. It showed Arlette at age 13. Braided hair, tense smile, a bruise faintly visible beneath one eye. She never caused trouble, Claire said. She never spoke back, but she remembered everything. Too much. That year, Anna returned to the chapel grounds with a drone and thermal imaging equipment. She launched the drone just before dusk. As the temperature dropped, the scan revealed one more anomaly. A section of ground behind the new structure, separate from the main basement, retained heat far longer than the surrounding area. Roughly 5 feet wide, 7 feet long. Rectangular. The soil sample later taken from the edge of that patch revealed traces of calcium phosphate, lime, and burned textile fibers. No exhumation occurred. No permit could be obtained. By 2022, only fragments remained. The names were documented, the walls reburied, the soil paved over, the silence formalized. What had been lost was no longer in dispute. What remained was the record of refusal. Names turned into noise. Families turned into footnotes. Justice bracketed by doctrine. and beneath it all the stone waited. If this story impacted you, if you stayed until the end, it's because you feel these hidden truths also need to be exposed. So leave in the comments the city you're watching from. This way we can see how far these stories are reaching, and subscribe to the channel. There are many other cases the world tried to forget. But we insist on remembering